Hey, Larkin Rose here, and this is the sixth and final installment in my Slave Think series, which is appropriate because tomorrow is when the Jones Plantation goes public. There will be the watch party tomorrow night. Both of these can be found at jonesplantationfilm.com. There's a watch party tomorrow night, which is like $20. It includes the director and myself and some other people doing a live stream before the movie, and then we show the whole movie, and then we go after the movie and basically go as long as we want and answer questions and have a discussion and all that fun stuff. The next day, Sunday, the movie should be for sale, and it's just by itself for like $9.99. But that'll all be at jonesplantationfilm.com. So, I have been covering a bunch of stuff based on the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. I'm going to include the link below if you want to pick up his autobiography from Amazon. I highly suggest people read the whole thing if you want a kind of rude slap in the face awakening of the realities of slavery, which is something that most people, black and white and every other color, don't really understand today. It's easy to picture it as if you were put into slavery all of a sudden, but that's not what it was. You have a different experience and outlook. You've been surrounded by a different culture and mentality and philosophy your whole life. So it's not like, well, they knew everything we know and they thought the same way and everything, and they just happened to be slaves. No, the entire process of mental enslavement was very deliberate and got people to a point where a bunch of people thought, not only the beneficiaries of slavery thought, well, this is legitimate and appropriate and this is an okay thing to own people, but some of the people being owned thought it was legitimate too. They didn't like it, like they complained about it and wrote songs lamenting the horrible injustice and suffering, but they still thought, oh well, this is how things are. And sadly enough, that's kind of most of humanity for most of history. Horrible things going on, whether it's, a king somewhere who the peasants are starving to death and he can show up and do whatever he wants and just murder people, and they're like, this is how things are. Or people who live in a war zone where ruling classes are like blowing stuff up and murdering people all over the place, fighting over territory, and people are just, wow, this is how things are. Yeah, it sucks, but oh well, like they can't imagine a fundamentally different world. And so, my mission in life, and I know this is true for a lot of you, is to change how people fundamentally view the world and humanity and morality in ways that don't allow for the enslavement of mankind. Again, I have to say this for the millionth time, I'm not at all comparing the degree of suffering between actual, chatteled slaves working in the fields picking cotton for 16 hours a day and what Americans go through now. I'm not saying, well, that's an equal level of suffering. Duh. Obviously it's not. But the foundational psychological manipulation underlying all of politics is the same foundation that was underlying slavery and all manner of other oppression and injustice throughout thousands of years of history. So, a first quote that we're going to do today from his book goes like this, quote, "For all slaveholders with whom I have ever met, religious slaveholders are the worst. I have ever found them the meanest and basest, the most cruel and cowardly of all others." Now, he goes into great length about that and talks about specifics of different slave masters. It shows the ability of people to detach the principles they say they believe in and the goodness they think they possess with whatever form of nasty immoral domination happens to be acceptable right then. Like today, the vast majority of people who call themselves Christian advocate the violent extortion and domination of everybody they know by way of politics. They don't think there's a conflict there. They don't notice a conflict there. They think, no, we're good, like law-abiding Christians who go and vote to have everybody we know forced to fund things that they don't like. Well, would you do that on your own? Does that sound like the whole do unto others as you would have done unto you? No. Oh, but this is by way of politics, so it's okay. And people's ability to compartmentalize and make excuses for the evil crap they believe in and condone or actually personally commit, that's been around for a long time, even to the point that you have people who are very proud of being caring, generous Christians who are not only pretending to own other human beings, but were some of the most vicious, nasty people around. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details that Frederick Douglass goes through. Again, feel free to read his book and see just how compassionate and loving and Christ-like some of these supposed Christians were who owned other people, or claimed to own other people. So, anyway, that's sort of an aside. Then Frederick describes how the religious slave master's, quote, maxim was, behave well or behave ill, it is the duty of a master occasionally to whip a slave to remind him of his master's authority. In other words, every once in a while, even if they didn't do anything wrong, remind them of your control over them and your right to rule them by whipping a slave. And if you look at the number of laws on the books and the number of ways in which cops will just arbitrarily pull people, do you know I pulled you over because some random sticker on your car doesn't have the right number on it, now give me $200. The constant harassment for stupid stuff that didn't require anything and wasn't justified is a reminder that you are the subject of a ruling class. We can do whatever the hell we want and you're going to obey and you're going to take it. Because if they only passed laws that were like, don't steal and don't murder, like if they only passed laws against other people committing aggression, they wouldn't have that much power because the vast majority of people, the vast majority of the time, wouldn't have to give a crap about government because, well, I'm not robbing or attacking anybody, so I don't care. But to remind us of their authority, they have to have, and to empower and enrich themselves, they have to have a gazillion laws that have nothing to do with protecting anybody. It's just robbery. Oh, you want to have a lemonade stand? Well, you have to give us a little bit of money and we'll give you a license to have a lemonade stand. Oh, you want tint on your car windows? Well, you're going to get pulled over by an armed thug you don't know who's going to have a special machine that determines whether it's too much tint and then we have to steal a bunch of your money, or whether it's the amount of tint approved by the king. And this is a real thing they do all the time. And one of the purposes of having laws about absolutely everything is to be able to remind people of the control they have over you. And Ayn Rand had a great quote about, it's in Atlas Shrugged, one of the characters is explaining, like, are you under the impression we want everybody to obey the law? No, we don't get any power and control out of that. We want there to be so many laws that it's completely unknowable, so that at any time we can just arbitrarily find something and make an example of them to, like, remind them of our authority and to control every aspect of everyone's lives. Well, that's just the modern equivalent of the psycho slave master who's like, yeah, whether they did something or not, every once in a while just whip one and make up an excuse and falsely accuse them or whatever, just to remind them, quote, of their master's authority. Blech. Okay, Frederick Douglass then said this of a different religious slave master who was all proud of his piety while being an evil psycho to other human beings. Quote, his chief boast, meaning this slave master, was his ability to manage slaves. The peculiar feature of his government was that of whipping slaves in advance of deserving it. He always managed to have one or more of his slaves to whip every Monday morning. He did this to alarm their fears and strike terror into those who escaped. His plan was to whip for the smallest offenses to prevent the commission of large ones. Mr. Hopkins could always find some excuse for whipping a slave. Like the cops who literally admit, if I drive behind you for 2 minutes, I can absolutely find some reason to give you a ticket. It may be some obscure thing you didn't even know was the case. You didn't wait long enough between turning your turn signal on and changing lanes or some arbitrary random thing. That is the mentality to keep everybody constantly feeling like, scared that, are we doing everything right? And at any moment they may rob us, not because we're threatening anybody or harming anybody. Like, almost everybody now, if they have a cop behind them, is nervous. It's not because they did something wrong. It's because they know damn well it doesn't matter if you did something wrong. The cops can and will find an excuse to detain you with the threat of violence. I've explained before how the flashing red and blue lights are always a threat of violence. They're not just asking nicely, please pull over. They're saying, okay, you're going to pull over, or I'm going to call more and more of my gang until we make you pull over. And if you make us have to resort to that, then we're probably going to beat the crap out of you or tase you or something like that. But people are nervous around cops because they know damn well it has nothing to do with, well, are you being nice to other people? Are you being a good person? No, it doesn't matter. They will and can find an excuse to rob you, whether it's just making something up or finding some stupid obscure law you didn't know to give you a citation for. You were driving 5 over the speed limit on a road where literally everybody else was doing that too, but we're going to rob you for doing what everybody else is doing and what isn't endangering anybody, and in fact, what you had to do in order to not endanger anybody. But the purpose is not to make people be nice to each other. The purpose is to remind them that they are subjects. And you can see that in the mentality of the slave masters. Okay, now I'm going to move on to a pivotal event in Frederick Douglass's life. He gives a full detailed account of it in his book. I don't have time to do that here. But again, the link is in the description below if you want to read the whole thing. He says, quote, "If at any one time of my life more than another I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey." Now, Mr. Covey was renowned as a slave breaker. If somebody dared to try to have their own free will and make their own decisions and stuff like that, he was famous for being able to break the will of slaves, and he was so good at it that he would basically get a bunch of free labor because other slave owners would lend him their slaves who would then work for him while he was in the process of basically breaking their spirit and breaking their soul, and making them more easily controlled. And this is, this isn't the sophisticated Mr. Smith style of indoctrination. This is just brute violence. So this is old style slavery, which, as we've seen, includes both, but it had a lot more of the overt brutality. So Frederick Douglass is describing, quote, "We were worked in all weathers." And he goes through, whether it was raining or cold, it doesn't matter. They were working them to death. And he said, quote, "I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went there, but a few months of this discipline tamed me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold, a man transformed into a brute." So the fact that he could give a first-hand account of what he had to go through to just completely break his spirit and make him, part of him not even want to have freedom. And he goes into great detail, and it's long and horrible to read, but read it anyway, so you know reality. But after all that, he says this, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." And he describes this in great detail. I was tempted to read the whole thing, but it would take too long. So he's working, doing something, and he's sick. And he's trying to do it. This is Frederick Douglass. And until he literally just collapses. He can't stand up. And Master Covey, this slave breaker, finds him. He's like, "Oh, get to work," and kicks him and stuff. Like the cliche, nasty stuff you'd expect to see in a slave movie. And so he tries to get up and he falls over again and he literally just can't stand up because he's so sick. And so in this condition, it's a little bit sad that in this condition, this was when he finally just had enough and he resists. And he starts to fight back and he starts like resisting Covey. And then they're like wrestling around and Covey's trying to beat the crap out of him. It went on and on. One little thing he mentions that I like and have to mention is somebody else that worked for Covey named Bill. Well, here's his account. Quote, "By this time, Bill came. Covey called upon him for assistance." Like the Covey and Frederick are wrestling around. Bill wanted to know what he could do. Covey said, "Take hold of him, take hold of him." Bill said his master hired him out to work and not to help whip me. So he left Covey and myself to fight our own battle out. You're sort of like, screw you. I didn't get hired to like help you abuse slaves. Up yours. Bye. So this Bill guy, I don't even know anything else about him, but he just walked out. So this wrestling match continues just on. And they're just duking it out and beating the crap out of each other. And this is with Frederick Douglass, like he started so sick he could barely stand up. And a bunch of stuff happens between. But he finally physically fights back. And he finally, in his brain, that switch just clicks. And he's like, I'm done with this. I'm done with this crap. I'm not going to grovel. I'm not going to try to get his approval. I'm just going to beat the crap out of him. I'm going to try to get away. I'm going to try to fight. And that shift in mentality, when somebody's been trained to respect authority, of being able to step over into, you're just a guy and you're an evil guy and I'm not putting up with this crap. And I'm going to escalate it to whatever level I need to match your escalation of trying to control and dominate and enslave me. So I won't go through the whole details of the whole battle, but here's what he said afterwards. Quote, "This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free." Incidentally, I have to point out here, as somebody else pointed out in the comments, this was somebody who was raised as a slave, and it was a pretty long time before he learned how to read. Listen how eloquently, I think he wrote this when he was 27. I think he wrote his autobiography when he was 27. How many 27-year-olds in the U.S. today do you know who are this eloquent? I know like almost none. And so, yeah, that just, it's worth pointing out the mental ability that they were trying to stomp down and that he developed because of his love for freedom. It's pretty freaking impressive. Anyway, to continue his words, quote, "The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation for whatever else might follow, even death itself." So sort of the attitude of like, screw you. I'm fighting back. I'm resisting. I'm not, even if you kill me, it was still better to do this. This was still worth it. I'm not putting up with it. You may recall the whole give me liberty or give me death thing by Patrick Henry. Frederick Douglass actually mentions that direct quote and points out that, yeah, as slaves, that's like way more true for us than some kind of rich white guy complaining about a king on the other side of the ocean. Like, in both cases, it's justified if you ask me. But yeah, if you're a slave and you actually reach the point where it's like, give me liberty or give me death, I'm fighting back. I'm not putting up with this crap. You can be stronger than me. You can have a bunch of hired thugs to do your bidding. But at some point, I'm just not putting up with that. That shift in mentality is a huge thing. And he's talking about the freeing nature of that, even if it's going to end in his death, which for him, that was a pretty high likelihood. Given his situation, he's like, I don't care. I've had enough, I'm not putting up with this. Like, he actually followed through on the give me liberty or give me death. Quote, "He only can understand the deep satisfaction which I experienced who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of slavery. I felt as I never felt before. It It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. My long-crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place, and I now resolved that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. That was him realizing mental slavery or mental freedom was the thing that matters. Like, you might be able to chain me to a tree or whip me or physically dominate me, but if I don't think and act and respond like a slave, I'm not a slave anymore. Which is why he said, he's describing the difference between a slave in form, as in I kind of look like it because right now I'm being whipped and stuff, but I'm not your slave because my brain escaped the indoctrination. Quote, I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. From this time I was never again what might be called fairly whipped, though I remained a slave 4 years afterwards. I had several fights, but was never whipped. And to me, that's pretty damn amazing. Now, he also describes how he was kind of amazed that they didn't just kill him or whip him a gajillion times for that. And his best guess, which he admits doesn't even fully explain it to him, but his best guess was that because Covey had a reputation as, this awesome slave breaker, he wouldn't want it to get out that I think Frederick Douglass was 16 at the time. He wouldn't want to let it get out that a sick slave that was barely able to stand up was kicking his ass, and he failed to break his soul. I mean, he broke it for a while, and then the freedom came back and was rekindled. He's like, screw you, I'm not going along with that. But that's very important to know. Anyway, that was Frederick Douglass's best guess of they didn't even whip him for duking it out with Covey. He said it went on for hours of them fighting and wrestling around and stuff. But that's just Frederick Douglass's best guess of why he wasn't whipped. But I think he's probably right. And you can see a similar thing when it comes to government, is when somebody says, screw you, I'm just not going along. I'm not going to petition for different legislation or vote for somebody else. Just not going along with your crap anymore. At some point, government knows it has to back off. There was the incident with the Bureau of Land Management and the bridge, the whole Bundy standoff when there were a bunch of people on the bridge and the feds showed up with a bunch of guns. And the people are like, well, if this is going to be a shootout, I guess it's going to be a shootout, but we're not going along with this crap. And the feds backed off and left. And later they arrested people and continued with their terroristic BS. And over in another place, they just murdered Lavoy Finicum, which is just horrendous. So it's not like, oh, just disobey and everything will go well. And Frederick Douglass obviously wasn't saying that. He's like, I'm going to disobey even if they freaking kill me because I'm done with this. I'm not going to pretend this is okay. I'm not going to pretend I'm their rightful property. And those in power have a vested interest in having it not get out that us mere peasants, or in this case, the slaves, if they just don't put up with it and they resist, it becomes impossible to enslave them. Even if you can still kill them. If somebody resists the cops, yeah, they might get shot. And that would be horrible. And it's probably a good thing to try to avoid. But once somebody has decided, I'm not going to answer to you. You're not authority over me. I own myself. I'm going to be free, even if that means you kill me. That's a really important message. And the thing from Braveheart, they might take our lives, but they will never take our freedom. That's expressing the same sentiment. It's yeah, you can kill me. You can try. I'm going to try to have you not kill me. But whether you succeed or not, I'm not your slave anymore. I don't answer to you anymore. I don't acknowledge your right to do anything anymore. And if you kill me, okay, I won't be here, but I won't be your slave. And if you don't kill me, I will be here, and I still won't be your slave. I'm done being your slave either way. And so the ability to shift into that mentality, having been indoctrinated your whole life to respect and obey authority, whether you're talking about people today or somebody who was literally raised as a slave, that spark and that enlightenment and that ability to stand up and be a man is just, it's amazing. And it keeps resurfacing in humanity over and over and over again. It's sort of the Neo thing. Well, we try to make this easily manageable, group of peasants to produce for us, mindless peasants. But for some reason, human nature keeps making this thing appear of some individuals now and then are going to say, yeah, this is wrong. I'm not putting up with this crap. And, how many movies and stories are there about that? Because it's such an inspiring thing when the victim of abuse and domination and oppression finally says, well, whatever the outcome, we have to try to fight it. At some point, we have to draw the line and say, this is where I'm not going along anymore. And that ability to disobey and resist, that is the entire thing. Because when the subject class or the slaves or, whatever the given scenario is, when they get to a point mentally that they feel justified in resisting, then the master's days are numbered. Because if your slave doesn't think it's legitimate and feels justified in running away or killing you or, just sitting there and I'm not doing any work, the Gandhi route, I'm not a pacifist, but if they just we're not going to serve you, you can beat us up, but we're just going to sit here and not do what you say. Once the victims of authoritarian domination decide, I'm not playing your game anymore one way or another, the game is going to fall apart because it cannot be maintained by brute force alone, especially when the victims of it are willing to use brute force in response. And so that the whole, people have one of the shirts I was wearing in this series is that disobedience is the foundation of liberty. You probably couldn't read that whole thing while I was sitting here because half of it's behind the chair. And a bunch of people have shirts that say disobey and resist. And that really does sum up the mentality that has to happen, because anything within the context, and this is why I make fun of political action, because if your focus is, we want to vote a different guy onto the throne, or we want to petition the masters to please change their legislation and not quite rob us as much, or let us have a little bit more freedom over here. That's a slave groveling to the master for mercy. That is not a free person saying, I'm not your property anymore, screw you, I don't need your permission. And so that change in mindset from what can we do to have the law changed, which is basically how can we convince the master to give us permission to be a little bit more free, shifting that over to screw the law, screw the master and his commands and his supposed authority. We don't have any obligation to go along with any of that crap. Now, the practical challenge is still there if people have to say, well, what's the risk? Frederick Douglass didn't just go, I'm free, I'm going to try to walk off right now. He conspired with other slaves of different plans of trying to escape and how are we going to do this? And he describes their process of thinking, imagining all the ways in which it could go horribly with them trying to escape. They were going to try to get in a boat and go up north and do all these things and plan all these things. So it's not the moment you understand it, you just resist everything and then get killed, because on a practical level, not only is that not good for you, but it doesn't necessarily accomplish anything. But once the mentality shifts into, I'm not beholden to you assholes, then all the practical solutions are just a matter of time and logistics. Just like for Frederick Douglass, once his brain was in the position of, because he had that battle with Covey and it was 4 years until he actually physically got free. But he spiritually got free that day, which means it was only a matter of time before he physically got free. And it's sad to watch how many people now who aren't threatened with the whip and they are threatened with law enforcement doing stuff to them if they disobey any of the myriad of arbitrary laws. But they can imagine that they're free. Hey, I have a house and I have a car and I have my family. I can go wherever I want as long as I pay registration and license my car and do all this and pay tolls on the roads and do all these different things to obey the master. The master will let me go anywhere I want. Well, not quite anywhere I want, and I need permission, So this imaginary freedom, it's basically free-range slavery. Like, we're not going to keep you on this plantation, but now we, the parasitic ruling class, have the ability to keep track of you, and so much of finances are reported to everybody, so we steal a cut, and we convinced the people you trade with to steal a cut on our behalf. If you go and buy something, the person you buy it from will rob you and call it sales tax and give us so the slaves are robbing the slaves a lot of the time. We don't even have to come do anything. Not even our thugs have to come rob you. We have you all trained to rob each other. Sales tax and income tax. If you go get a job, the employer will, well, I have to steal a bunch of money from you and give it to the IRS. Like, they don't even have to show up. They don't have to do anything. They just send a form, and the employer will help the parasites to rob their employees. It's the slaves robbing the slaves. Incidentally, there's one of the many little subplots in the Jones Plantation is when they make two of the former slaves into enforcers and part of the security team, or whatever silly terminology you want to use for that. And how eagerly the slaves can be given a little bit of power and will grab onto it and feel important when literally their job is to abuse their fellow man and help their abuser to victimize the people they should be friends with and allies with. And you see that in the movie, just like you saw it you see it throughout history all over the place. You see it in slaves who were put on a higher level and then look, I'm a house slave, I can look down on you field slaves. Malcolm X did a speech about that, which is pretty cool. Incidentally, I'll mention again that between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., I much prefer Malcolm X, even though he did the pack mentality racist thing for a pretty long time. He did get over that and realize, it isn't just white people, like maybe a hell of a lot of white people, especially when he was speaking. But it isn't just, if you're white, you're evil. It's just the mentality and culture of a lot of white people back then made them advocates of evil. So eventually he got over his collectivist, groupthink himself. But Malcolm X wasn't about grovel and bow to the master and let him beat you up and ask him for mercy. He was about, why would I do that? Like, defend yourself. Like, I'm a man, he's a man. Why the hell would I let him get away with that? There's actually a line that Samuel, the hero of the movie, says, they're just mortal men and so are we. Why are we treating them like superiors? So just that shift, there's different ways to look at it and different ways to describe it, but the process of giving up the belief in authority is the beginning of disobey and resist. Because to disobey, like for somebody to physically disobey, first they have to be in a mental state where they feel like disobedience is justified. And if you've been taught to believe in authority, by definition, you've been taught that obedience is a virtue. That thing has the right to rule you, because that's literally what the word authority means, and that you therefore have an obligation to obey, because that logically follows. Well, if they have the right to do this to us, then obviously we're obliged to obey, and if we don't, we're the bad guys. And a lot of people, even in outright slavery, had that as their view of reality. And it took a lot for them to escape that. And it's taken a lot for human beings to escape various flavors and brands of authoritarianism all over the world throughout history and have their minds break free of the authoritarian crap they were taught. And the underlying principles and the underlying psychology involved, the more you read of Frederick Douglass and other accounts, the more you see it's the same in slavery days as it is right now and as it's been in the whole world for all of history, whether the ruling class is like some church or a government or gangs or little feudal lords that and say, everybody on this piece of dirt anywhere near me, you're suddenly my property because I said so. And the mental process of escape is the thing that matters. And the mental enslavement is the real threat to humanity, because without the mental enslavement, the physical enslavement is always temporary and fragile and unstable. And that's literally what Mr. Smith teaches Mr. Jones. is the quote, we put this in the trailer. Yeah, you can control a man for a time with brute force, but you cannot truly own a man unless he believes that your word is law and that he is obligated to obey it and virtuous for doing so. And that about sums up the belief in authority and teaching people to think that this is legitimate, that this is righteous, that obedience is an obligation, and that if you're a good human being, you will serve your master well. And to read Frederick Douglass, his account of finally figuring out, no, I'm done with that crap, is like one of the most, his story is one of the most depressing, horrible things ever. But the conclusion and watching his brain find its way out of that indoctrination is like one of the most inspiring things I've ever read. Despite the fact that, as I said, I read it while in prison for not answering to the IRS and not sending them pieces of paper. So that was a little ironic, or maybe not. So, yeah, again, I highly recommend people read his whole autobiography. And tomorrow, the Jones Plantation goes public. And I highly recommend that you not only see it, but find a way to share it with everyone you know. Tomorrow is the watch party where we want people to be able to, you sign up once, it's $20. You can have 10 people over to your house. You can have 100 people over to your bar. Somebody I know, his friend owns a bar, and they're going to be, signing up to have a viewing there and have a watch party. So it's not like each person has to pay that separately. And we're gonna see if we can set it up to have some of those on live streams so we can check in with the groups before and after the movie and so what did you think? Get feedback and do question and answer and fun stuff like that. So that's the watch party. That will be happening tomorrow night, and then the next day on Sunday, and from then on the movie will be for sale for I think $9.99 by itself. And all of that you can find at jonesplantationfilm.com. But this really is about unenslaving minds because, to quote Samuel, unless you free your minds from their lies, you will never free your bodies.